Welcome to the Big Four Accounting Firms podcast, brought to you by big4accountingfirms.com and the Big Four Accounting Firms YouTube channel. Before we get started, just wanted to remind everybody to support us if you have a chance or if you can. Even $1 helps, and we have a link in the description to a website called Buy Me a Coffee. It's just a way to donate to us and support us. Again, any amount is helpful so that we can keep putting out content. And there's also other ways for you to support us in the show notes to this podcast or on YouTube in the description. In today's podcast, I wanted to discuss some recent news about KPMG's revenues. And more specifically, we're going to be talking about KPMG Australia, because for some reason, KPMG Australia already reported their financial results. As you know, KPMG is one of the last Big Four accounting firms to report their global news. They do it later in the year, typically around November. But KPMG Australia went ahead and reported their results. It's pretty shocking what they were able to achieve in the prior year. According to KPMG, they were able to achieve growth of 7% in their latest fiscal year. And this means they achieved revenues of $1.9 billion for their fiscal year. And according to themselves, they were reportedly on track to record 13% growth up until February of 2020. Now, the fact that KPMG is reporting these numbers right now means that their fiscal year in Australia probably ended in April or May. So this doesn't really have the full effect of COVID-19 in here. So up next, let's talk about some comments that their CEO made. Now, Gary Winegrove is the CEO of KPMG Australia, and he had the following things to say about the financial results. We've had a good financial year, all things considered, and I'm proud of what we achieved, working closely together as a firm and continuously supporting our clients. I thank our people and partners for their resilience and unwavering effects in delivering this hard-won and pleasing result. So you see in that comment, he's kind of patting himself on the back. And some more things he had to say was that as the health and economic impacts of the pandemic deepened, it became inevitable that we would fall short of strong growth projections set at the start of the year. We had invested quite heavily in the first half to deliver that growth, which has now had a flow-through negative impact on profit. By acting swiftly and decisively early in the pandemic, we have protected the underlying health of the firm. That challenge ahead is for this to continue. And Alison Kitchen, who's the KPMG chairman, had the following statements about KPMG Australia's results. The board considers that Gary and his team have done an excellent job in deeply challenging circumstances. They have kept us in good financial stead while delivering balanced and thoughtful outcomes for our people, clients, and partners. They're patting each other on the back here, but it's not Gary doing something. It's not Allison doing something. Two people can't hold a whole firm up, and they can't really keep the firm up in a worsening economic environment, in a downturn. Right now, they're reporting on results that include COVID-19, but most likely a couple of months, maybe 3 months at most. So let's see if they're patting each other on the back in a year. But with that, let's take a deeper dive into the numbers released by KPMG Australia. Audit had a 9% growth rate, and this was due to a focus on enhancing audit quality according to KPMG. And they also said that risk consulting did well for them in the audit environment. And they just reported growth rates. They didn't report the actual revenue numbers. And deals, tax, and legal revenue was up 8% over the past fiscal year. And they said much of that growth was due to infrastructure advisory, international tax, and the growing legal group. And the Big Four accounting firms have been getting more and more into the legal environment because they realize that the largest companies in the world come to them for professional services. And the more they do in the legal world, the more work they're going to win. Because legal work is similar to accounting work. The only problem is that accounting firms don't typically have lawyers outside of tax. But if people are used to coming to you for professional services, then why not have a legal group? Next up that we're going to discuss is the enterprise group. The enterprise group's revenue growth was up 5.8% year over year. And next up is management consulting. Management consulting revenue was up 4.6%. And this was the poorest performing group. This makes sense, though, because as the economy gets worse, discretionary spending goes down, and the most discretionary spending is going to be within management consulting. And lastly is their strategy group. And this performed the best out of all divisions for KPMG Australia. And the growth of the strategy group was up 13.5% in the past fiscal year. My first reaction to those growth percentages is they don't make sense, because how does all of those huge percentages, like those are great growth percentages, how does all of that add up to 7%? I'm not entirely sure, unless the enterprise group and the management consulting is a huge percentage of the revenues, but I really doubt that's the way it is. So I'm not sure these numbers make sense. They seem really positive in a bad negative environment, and they don't really add up. But we'll have to see how things pan out in the future. Okay, the other thing that was interesting about this release is that there's a bunch of other information in here. I mean, most of it was what I would say is pretty useless. But the one thing that I was amazed about is that KPMG Australia talked about their cost-cutting measures. And this is where KPMG Australia spoke about their cost-cutting measure that they took as it relates to COVID-19. They stated that they laid off 200 people. However, in their press release for these revenues, they called the layoffs redundancies instead of layoffs. But we all know they are layoffs because we reported this information previously. And make sure to check out our COVID-19 layoff tracker to stay up to date on all the layoff news. And they also said that they forced their employees to take a 20% pay cut. And at the time, if you remember, they made it seem optional, even though it wasn't really optional and there was basically 100% adoption. I'm sure there was peer pressure and pressure from supervisors. And these pay cuts took place from May 2020 until August 2020. So that means they're still ongoing this month. And KPMG said that they will try to repay some of the pay reductions, and people will begin receiving 100% of their base salaries starting in September of 2020. They also stated in this announcement that they're delaying all promotions until January of next year. And they said that the graduate hires, this is hires out of university, were about the same as 2019 with 600 new hires. So for those of you worried out there about getting new jobs, it seems that they had the same amount of new hires in KPMG Australia. Now, they should have had growth if there was 7% growth in revenue, but they're obviously being conservative with COVID-19. There's a huge section in here about inclusion targets. As we know from information released by the Big Four, that diversity and inclusion is important for them. It's popular right now, so the Big Four are jumping on the bandwagon, even though they're not really good at it. But they at least try to make it seem like they are. And they spoke about this in the KPMG Australia press release. They said that they achieved their women partner target of 30%, and they actually beat it because they achieved 31.2% of partners that are women. And they set that goal in 2015. And they did not mention how they are doing in the cultural diversity category, but they did state that they have a goal in that category. They seek to have 20% cultural diversity in their partnership by 2025, but they did not say how they're doing right now, which is very interesting. It's probably a very low number. KPMG Australia also spoke about their initiatives with regards to climate change and human rights. And this is important for everybody out there, because people out there should look at all of these initiatives from the Big Four and speak about it when you're in your interview or even when you join the job. You shouldn't only worry about client work. You need to talk about these outside things that the Big Four are obsessed with, like climate change, human rights. And if you work in Australia, there's another thing that Australia has. They have a Modern Slavery Act that they have to comply with. And this is basically all large companies in Australia have to comply with this. And this was the first year that they had to comply with it. And shocker, KPMG Australia did not notice that they were in violation of the Modern Slavery Act. And I'm not sure how any company meets these standards. It's very subjective. And obviously, the Big Four accounting firms in Australia are helping consulting with this Modern Slavery Act, in addition to having to meet with it. And they admit in their documents that the Asia-Pacific region, where Australia is the toughest region to stay compliant in. It's very interesting to me about this Modern Slavery Act, because how can a Big Four accounting firm speak about modern slavery when they have a production quota for their employees around the world? Additionally, many of the largest companies in the world use slave labor, even though they might not call it that, especially in this Asia-Pacific region, to make their products. And I'm not sure what this regulation or statement from KPMG is supposed to do other than virtue signal. And it's very subjective as to what you would consider slave labor. But basically, it's very good for people to learn from this modern slavery document and act, because you can see how it's wording and infographics and putting it in the PDF format and nice and neat for regulatory purposes. That's really going to keep them off the radar of regulators. And lastly, KPMG mentioned their charity work. In Australia, KPMG employees volunteered over 44,000 hours of their time. And this is pretty consistent with what the Big Four accounting firms are doing around the globe. It is important to volunteer while you work for the Big Four. You need to join in on this so that you can keep moving up, because it's leadership's expectation that their employees volunteer. Because, look, they're putting it in the results, in the financial results, which means they want to show recruits and clients what they're doing here. And they need participation. If you don't participate, then it means you're not buying into what leadership is preaching, and you need to buy into it. But also, you need to start before you need to start volunteering before you even join the Big Four, so that you can become adapted to it and used to it. Another thing that I thought was interesting is they said that they conducted 200 pro bono engagements, including work for the Suicide Prevention Australia program. The Big Four accounting firms in the US don't really talk about pro bono engagements, but it's actually better to me to say that they do pro bono engagements, because that's really good professional services that they're giving to people and clients that need it, versus just volunteering time doing basic volunteer work. I think that would be a good way to stand out if you're working in the Big Four accounting firms, is pitch a pro bono engagement to your partners that you could potentially do for a charity or a nonprofit. Those are the results for KPMG Australia. I feel like we learned a lot. I feel like we also have a lot of questions, because their revenue growth is very good, even with the couple of months of COVID in there. It'll be interesting to see what happens with the other Big Four accounting firms as they keep on releasing their financial results. To stay up to date on all those financial results and Big Four news, make sure to subscribe to this podcast and support us through the Buy Me a Coffee website that we put in the show notes. And if you can't support us financially, then if you could, it'd be really helpful if you subscribe on YouTube or give this video a like on YouTube. Thanks for listening.